Good afternoon. My name is Becky Sullivan, project lead for the Literacy Coaches and Reading Specialist Educator Training Grant, or LCR set, at the Sacramento County Office of Education. We are thrilled to have so many of you join us for this webinar series with Dr. Daryl Michel. The goal of our grant is to develop training and provide professional development for educators to become literacy coaches, reading and literacy specialists, and provide supports for the LEAs that receive the Literacy Coach and Reading Specialist allocation. Today is our final session of the four-part webinar series, taking a deep dive into Dr. Daryl Michel's book, Student Focused Coaching. For today's webinar, Dr. Michel will continue to discuss topics in his book, Student Focused Coaching, by exploring components of the SALES framework, focusing on instructional leadership and setting conditions for successful coaching, and relating the learning to your context. And now, please welcome Jessica Hammond, our partner from Glean Education.
Thank you, Becky. We are thrilled to partner with Sacramento and Napa County's Office of Education and the LCR SET Grant Initiative to coordinate this webinar series. For those of you who may not know about us, Glean Education partners with schools, districts, and states to deliver online training, school leader consulting, and web-based and job-embedded coaching. Our work aims to build educator knowledge of evidence-based literacy practices to improve student literacy outcomes. This is the fourth in a series of 4 webinars this year on student-focused coaching. This webinar will be recorded and posted on the SCOE and Glean Education websites. The link for that is in the chat. Slides and resources can also be found on the LCR SET Expert Webinar Padlet, and we'll put that link in the chat as well. For this webinar, I'm thrilled to welcome Dr. Daryl Michel. Daryl Michel's education profession began in the mid-90s as a classroom teacher in the Northside Independent School District in San Antonio, Texas. His experience led him to roles in instructional coaching and leadership, with a research-based program developed at Johns Hopkins University, as well as opportunities to collaborate with educators on a national level. In 2005, Daryl returned to Texas, where he completed his PhD in education school improvement at Texas State University. He now continues to work in instructional coaching at Be a Change, while also working as a staff member at the Meadows Center at UT Austin. He is author of Student-Focused Coaching with Jan Hasbrook and other forthcoming works. Please help me welcome Dr. Daryl Michel.
Thank you very much for this opportunity, and I really can't believe that here we are in part 4 of the 4-part series. So thank you all for joining or for being part of the series. Looking forward to diving into today's content around sharing the leadership. And so if you have your copy of Student Focused Coaching, we're going to be in chapter 11. So that's page 171. Similar to the last time, I'm going to have a few places in which there'll be some pauses and reflects. Just think about your own context in terms of the work around when we think of SALES, standards, assessments, instruction and intervention, leadership and sustainability. And so at that point in time, if you want to go to chat and take some time to put in your thoughts, your reflections about some of the content, please do. So we'll make sure we have time in there for that. So as Jessica said here, student focused coaching, and then other soon to be by August should be a second book that I co-authored with Dawn Brookhart. That one will be called Instructional Leadership in Student Focused Coaching. And that book will be available through Brooks as well. But we really all things around creating systems when we think about the work we do in terms of enhancing student learning. So the work we can really dive into, and we'll give a little taste of that here today in terms of some of what the content will be in that book. So here's our working agenda for our time together, and that will be starting here first with an exploration of the SALES framework and student-focused coaching. And then do a little dive into the 2 key kind of key themes that will run throughout the book, the new book on instructional leadership, and that's modeling your expectations, including your learning. And the second is to create the conditions for successful coaching, and or when we think about just creating these conditions for the successful teaching and learning, the work that we're all doing. And so then relating things as we go, I really would encourage you to try to make some of these connections as you go to whomever you're working with, and or yourself in terms of some of today's content. So pages 174 is really where the part about sales begins. Prior to that, you would have at the onset in the beginning part of chapter 11, there's really a lot around explicit instruction. And so when we borrow from the work of Anita Archer and Charles Hughes, as well as Brock Rosenshine's, and thinking through explicit instruction, some of those key pieces here around often framed in four major components when we think about the explicit instruction elements. And that's how we think about content, we think about design, think about delivery, and then practice. So in many cases, just the initial part and one of the explicit instruction kind of categories is content. And that definitely fits into this whole first part of thinking about the standards and thinking about the assessments. And then you start to dive into, ooh, how do we now take and start the design when we think of lesson design? But there first has to be a lot of knowledge that's built. In the California Common Core State Standard, so in preparing for this last session, I wanted to start things off when we think about standards. I wanted to start off with this to show that standards, when we think of sometimes the real specific skills and or concepts that maybe people go to frequently, or people look at some of the what they might be like, oh, this is a critical content is around this piece in vocabulary, or it's something around summarization, or it's something around making inferences. It's like, yes, all of those important, and sometimes those are the big things that we take and really try to pull apart and make sense of. Yet there's also all of these at the beginning of that Common Core State Standard document. You'll find that on page 4 of these bigger headings. And that includes when we think about reading, writing, speaking, and listening, and language in any grade level. I would also argue that these are all should all as well be used across the board in any subject area. But how we think about putting students when we're thinking through these, like student lens here, they demonstrate independence. So when planning and thinking through lessons, the work that we do, the work that I do as a teacher, how is it that I'm working through this and through that lens of students demonstrate independence? The second, they, meaning students, build strong content knowledge. Thinking about what does that really mean? What does that entail? That page 4 gives a little synopsis, but there'd also be a lot of conversation that would have to come into play here. But I think it's important to see that these, as written in that document, say that these are not standards themselves, but instead offer a portrait of students who meet the standards set out in this document. So really all of the different skills and the different standards throughout, we also have to be thinking of these. So how are we incorporating these into our planning and delivery? For today's purposes, I decided to take one of these standards here around craft and structure, and from the informational portion of reading. And when thinking about this, if you're in that document, you'll see on page 6 here, in the craft and structure, just reading this one standard, I don't know about you, but one of the first times that I encountered this language and reading it was like, wow, there is a lot here. Interpreting words and phrases as they're used in text, including determining technical, connotative, and figurative meanings, and analyze how specific word choices shape meaning or tone. Thought, wow, if someone just said that this is going to be the standard we're going to be focusing in on, I think that there might be a lot of people who are like, well, I don't even know necessarily what all of those different words mean. I haven't had any of the formal training around some of those. And I'm asked to teach standards, but we don't really have the time to pull these things apart. So I think really important to think, how would you take something like this one standard, but you're also putting in the context of, oh, how do students demonstrate independence when they're interpreting these words and phrases as they're used in text? How are they building strong content knowledge when that's the case? How are they using evidence when that's the case? How are they using technology and digital media when this is something we're maybe using to show our own understanding? So the complexity here sometimes of thinking like we're not just studying standards for the sake of standards. When we think of, from a prior session, when we think of the collaborative problem-solving process, is that we get to a place where we've identified a specific area, a problem or concern that we're going to be really honing in on. And part of our targeted action plan might be the study of a standard or standards. But it's not just putting sales here to say, we're going to study these different components in sales without grounding it in the student data and or that additional evidence. So I want to make sure that this is clear here, that this isn't just a standalone piece and we just dive into studying standards. No, we're not studying standards for the sake of it. We're studying these because it's part of a targeted action plan or because it's really grounding us in the student data and evidence. So we're going to take just this one piece here thus far, just the standards. And I'm going to ask you here to take a moment, just a quick pause here, and you can take to chat if you would like, and to put in any kind of thought, comment of related to this prompt. When analyzing a standard and or planning to teach one, what expectations, if any, are in place that teachers should include those anchor standards, that first set on page 4, remembering that they're not standards themselves, but they are part of offering that portrait. So let me give you a moment here to just pause. Feel free to take to chat to write your response here. It might be that we use it all the time. It might be that never even looked at those. I'm not sure people know what they are. So I'll pause and let you do a quick reflection here. You're probably not alone, Edith. Been overlooked. Mm. Yeah, Anthony, yeah, great point, right? How important that is. Yeah, and just as you're putting these in, your comments here, the part is that often we don't find these just in a reading and language arts. We would find similar things in mathematics and science and social studies. If we were to look at other subject area standards, we're likely going to find similar, if not the same ones. And so getting our students to a place or our teachers to really think through some of this. The comment here about, yeah, connecting the grade level standards. Yep. And the thought of even in a multi-age classroom, to me, like some of these become such an important part because we all have different standards at the different grade levels. We do have this opportunity for the continuity and the consistency to really think of how we discuss through this lens. So that in terms of just the initial part here of thinking about standards. Now, I'm going to move to this next part, and this is then to assessment. So when we think of, as I said, we've grounded our work in what we know from student data and evidence. So in a collaborative problem solving process, maybe we noticed throughout all of that work that vocabulary was an area of great need, depending upon the data that you're actually using and what you might take out of that. Another really important part then is that we think of, once we've gotten to this place of thinking about standards, well, now it's trying to think through this lens of then assessments. So using this same standard here about interpreting words and phrases, etc., you likely can look at this and say, well, there's a lot of different levels. If we were to align this with Dr. Norman Webb's work, I mean, who originally at the university at a University of Wisconsin at Madison, now Webb Align, these documents come from Norman Webb's work. So if you find that, oh yes, I've seen a lot of these things around DOK, and there's this wheel that we use with words, I'm going to tell you that Norman would put an X over that and say, that is not how we see depth of knowledge. That is not from us. Someone created this wheel. How we have studied and how we look at the cognitive complexity levels are through these different summary definitions. And so when we think of just from DOK1 simple to DOK4 more complex, this isn't so much to say that everything has to be DOK level 4. No, that's not true. We will have to base some things in terms of grounding from more simple to complex. What Norman and his group, when they initially were developing these in the mid-1990s, said when studying state standards and or different state assessments, what they found was that most things fell in DOK level 2 and 3. So I think that's important to think about here. Cognitive complexity within standards, especially for applying things back to the anchor work. In classrooms, though, what they found later with similar studies is that a great deal of instruction within classrooms are 1 and 2. And so if we were to think about some of the assessments that students might face, they may not actually be at the place where they're receiving the actual rigor. Now, if you go to and use that QR code there, the QR code would take you to Web Align's work and the resources. These documents are available for English language arts, mathematics, science, and social studies. So you really, if you wanted to apply this in a setting, you could take this one standard, something around vocabulary, and you probably could have everyone within your system looking at one of these documents. So when I take this and I start to think about, well, I'd have to really pull this apart from basic recall, kind of just regurgitating a definition to DOK level 2. We're starting to think of some of those different text structures. So compare, contrast, fact, opinion, problem, solution, etc. DOK level 3, we're really getting to this place where we're going to have to do more of synthesis, summarizing things. And DOK 4 might be that you've you compose a research paper from starting question to here's the final product. So not everything's going to fall there, but let's take this one this one standard, and For the many graduate classes that I've taught in assessment and evaluation, one thing that I've often found is that graduate students haven't done a whole lot with test blueprints. And people might talk about backward design, backward planning, and it's, yes, that's important, but knowing what's this assessment going to look like? What's the test going to look like at the end? And how is this test going to address the various levels of cognitive complexity? So this example, if you look down the left-hand column, the test blueprint is meant to, with a teacher, a group of teachers, could be you on your own, however, uh, but you're pulling apart this one piece, this one standard into the many different elements that might make this up. If you notice on the left-hand side, then, well, there are things related to the interpret words and phrases, the technical meanings, the connotative meanings, the figurative language and meaning. And then there's that latter part in that standard that also said, and analyze language choices. So I've put this is my own thinking. You may or may not agree if you get in and really be able to study and look at Webb's work. But you start to identify where these things fall within the level of cognitive complexity. And then the numbers represent how many items will be on the post-test. So in this example here, I would work with a group. We'd be planning out a unit, or we'd be studying a standard, whatever is the main thing for often a unit. This one, I would have, what, 2, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 total questions on my post assessment. I could use any format in terms of the types of questions that I want, but I'm going to have to make sure the type of questions that I'm writing go back to the cognitive complexity level. And think of how this might really help then when we get into instruction and intervention of making sure that I'm teaching at these different levels, making sure that I'm engaging students in these proper experiences at these different levels, and also thinking about appropriate scaffolds that might be necessary and needed here. So taking just this one standard alone to try to help people pull this apart. Now, the assessment we used on page 177 in student focused coaching, we'd used the Bloom's taxonomy. In the new instructional leadership book, we'll be using DOK. And then the chapter around depth of knowledge and assessment will also have all these different the types of test items that we might write, including advantages, disadvantages, but also some, how do you go about writing a really good binary choice item that could be not just DOK1, true, false, but it could fall into higher levels of DOK based on how we write them and what we're asking students to do. This though also with assessment, so if I think of the standard, pulling it apart, I think of then this test blueprint of the cognitive complexity levels. I'm also going to now have to be able to support and assist people of thinking about the types of test items, the type of assessments that we're going to use. Now, I don't like to assume that anyone has the knowledge of all things on page 176 of all these different ways that we might assess things. So you might find within your own system, you might find just for you as an individual that I have a lot more to learn here around each of these. From people might use a lot of informal assessments. Well, teacher made tests might be fine, but if I don't know how to write test items, then a teacher made test is not going to be very valid and reliable. I might have teacher made tests, but I don't have them written at these different levels of cognitive complexity, which means we're getting at a place to where we're not going to be attaining or reaching what that standard is actually asking us for. So a really important piece here to be thinking about, and why we do test blueprints before we get started with any unit planning, lesson planning, we start off with that piece. If you wanted, in many cases and in many places of places where I've supported as we think about this, often people who create the post test will use it the same or very similar for a pre-test. The pre-test, we get a really good sense then of who needs what. It also helps us to think through this unit, because what if Jessica and Becky and Ramisa already show that they understand this standard, and they can perform this at the different levels of cognitive complexity. uh, the hope would be that I don't have to sit through the next 3 weeks of lessons of just doing things I already know how to do. It's how I might start to base and think about. In a good MTSS model, we have systems in place for how we extend the learning for individuals, and not just all the remediation that comes with it. So standard into this part, thinking really about assessments. It's not about how many assessments, it's about what's needed and getting that appropriate level of cognitive complexity. So let me pause there and give you a couple of questions here to think about. So here, one, what, if anything, do individuals in your system know about depth of knowledge, assessments, or test blueprints? And depth of knowledge from the researcher himself and his group, should say, from Norman Webb's work. The second question is how, if at all, are test blueprints created before teaching a unit? So assuming there is, how is that then used? So let me pause, let you take to chat here for a moment and respond to one or both of these questions. Thanks, Maria. Yeah, could be really important there. Yeah. That's good to see you, Eleanor. Good, Judy. Yep. Luckily, it's part of what we do now. Oh, that's a great question, Anthony. I don't have any idea if Common Core curriculums, if they do that, if they create a test blueprint at all. I guess different systems, um, how people look at them. I don't know if it would be universal across the board. So maybe not. I also often tell people too that I think it's important, even if you go to someone or a system or a program and they say, this is DOK2, this is DOK whatever, that might work some of the time. But if you had that standard that we've just been looking at and someone said, that's a DOK2, you'd have to say, no, no, not all parts of that are a DOK2. There are parts that fall in many categories. So be cautious that not all things should just be just this generalized stamp on it of the DOK level. Very good, very good. So thank you for your responses there. So when you think about then, so we have standards and now then assessments, and then the part then we start to think then or with the instruction and intervention. Now, this might relate back to some of that explicit instruction. We think about content. Uh, when Anita Archer and Charles Hughes in their explicit instruction book, the first three explicit instruction elements are identify critical content, uh, A second one is about how we break things down into manageable chunks. And a third thing is how we sequence those. And so, even in this, as we think about this, we might take from the instruction and intervention portion and start to really be able to think about how we now support and plan instruction. Having these vertical alignments within the document would be really important here. So, whichever level, if we went and took a deep look at DOK level 3, that we could start to see determining the meaning of general academic vocabulary, what might have to happen for students who struggled in this particular area. So 2, 1, for some, maybe we have to go back to kindergarten, but also ways to maybe think about the extension. So for those of you who help people plan, or you as this in yourself planning, thinking about scaffolds. And so within Common Core or other different documents, certainly good for the vertical alignment piece. Now, I'm just going to show you a couple of other examples here. I'll ask you as well to take to chat for a couple of experiences here. But if we were to take still this same standard about interpreting words and phrases, this is related to the craft and structure and informational and vocabulary. And we were honing in on some of these words and phrases. We think about general academic vocabulary. Well, we might help some of our colleagues, or we ourselves might have to do additional study to understand the distinctions. There's content specific and there's general academic. So Isabel Beck's work and colleagues at the University of Pittsburgh and their different tiered approach, how those tier 2 words, those high utility, all purpose words we could use in really any subject area. How are we attacking those words? If we go to our core reading program, maybe they identify and they say it's general academic, but maybe it's really not. Maybe it's more content specific. So how do we support others, or for ourselves, of thinking about uh, general academic vocabulary? This is one example. If I were working with someone, or I was starting to think about just word wall cards of a word like analyze, just think of all the different ways the word analyze is used in reading, writing, mathematics, science, social studies, the elective, like any PE, music, art. You think about just this initial word analyze, as a base here for us to really think about. But then it becomes more of like, how do we allow students to then play on some of these words over time? So it's not just a one-time initial practice, it's the ongoing distributed and cumulative practice. So if you look down the left-hand side, you start to see all the different ways that we really could attack things like vocabulary, and the playing on of words with the affixes, adding different prefixes or suffixes. We could talk parts of speech. We could, in these vertical organization, helping to support some spelling patterns. But when we start to really think of, wow, how many words students could generate over what could be weeks and months, how fantastic would that be? Now you could take same thing if I said the word is compose. Let's just say the word is compose. If you took to chat right now and I said, that's your word, compose. I said, add prefixes and suffixes to that. What are some other words you might come up with? Yeah, composition. Good, panel. Look, you're ready to go. I mean, how cool is that when you think of what this could be like for students over a period of time. And I think even sometimes, when we're studying nonsense words or within nonsense word fluency, hey, maybe sometimes students are going to put words up and it's like, I don't know if that's really even a word. Well, I'm encouraging you to study that, to figure this out, uh, whether it really is or it's not. Uh, we could look at this was something that I wanted to do to show that this vocabulary is not just in reading and language arts, but these tier 2 general academic vocabulary words we will find all over in mathematics, in like word problems. We'll find them all over in science when we think about investigations. So 2 columns here on the left, these are all words that come from one state assessment, not the whole thing, but in some of the word problems, just some of the question stems. On the right, are from science. So if I only want to teach and hone in on some content specific words, I might be setting students up for not being as successful as I want them to be, because I haven't focused much on these tier 2 general academic words. But look at how much students could do with these. We'll take to chat again. This time, if I were to take a root, you see the root in the center. This comes from Deb Glazer's work and morpheme magic. You have prefixes and you have suffixes. You can take to chat and create as many words as you want using as many prefixes and or suffixes that you want. It doesn't just have to be one. Recon, deconstructive, indestructible. Nice. Mhm. So I could certainly give students some parameters here in terms of what you're looking for, but yeah, again, why teach just one word, or why focus on one root when students could have so much probably enjoyment in doing something like this, whether it's whole class, small group, partners, centers, and if word walls could be created where we're generating so many different words. Uh, the instruction and intervention then, how also if we came into play here, when we think about an instruction and intervention within student focused coaching, MTSS, if that is something that you have in terms of a model or RTI, Sharon Vaughn at the Plain Talk. Sharon is one of my I report to at my work at the Meadow Center. But Sharon at the recent Plain Talk Conference for Literacy and Learning, really encouraging people to be thinking about programs, products, etc. Of what are we asking students to do? And especially if we have struggling readers, are we asking them to go to multiple programs, multiple products, multiple resources, learning multiple strategies? Or are we setting them up for more success because we're aligning the instruction in tier 1 with what we're doing in intervention? So if I'm teaching a certain number of general academic vocabulary words in my core reading program, maybe in tier 2, we're reinforcing and practicing from prior. Maybe in tier 2, we're really practicing more about what it is that we're learning. Maybe in tier 3, we're taking those same words, but we're really reinforcing the different affixes, studying more of the morphemes and the roots. Or maybe even from tier 3 or tier 2, maybe in that intervention, we're introducing these vocabulary words to the students before they see them in tier 1. So then when they get to them, they can be more successful having some initial pre-knowledge. The QR code here takes you to a document that's part of a 10 key series at the University of Texas, the Meadow Center, producing, but there are many others there. But really being able to understand the standard, how we're going to assess it, and now thinking about how are we really helping people teach this and intervene, and not just flipping pages in a document. This comes from Carolyn Denton's work and colleagues, and this shows, which you might find helpful, if it's around that vocabulary standard and they give the cognitive complexity or different activities, a list of the percent of all prefixed words. Yeah, just knowing some of this might be really helpful of places to start, places to emphasize, or the percentage of all suffixed words. Just knowing that might be really helpful for someone as they're planning of their tier one or another intervention group, but those might be helpful. Some of the more common Greek and Latin roots could also be really helpful. And for those who don't have a deep knowledge base about syllable types, that as well might be some intervention that might be where we're helping students. And you think about those syllables and the different morphemes or just the different word parts that we could really study. And then, of course, within instruction and intervention, we think about system-wide consistency. I'm not going to go through this whole piece here, but when we think about if vocabulary is an area of target, like we've used as our example here, is there a consistent approach to how teachers teach general academic vocabulary, or is it left open to however you want? If it's the latter, then maybe we're not helping everyone using all the available time. But also maybe some students are missing out on certain things. So is there something common and consistent across the board of how we are identifying, in this case, vocabulary words to teach, and or common routine? And for those who think, oh, we got to always study making inferences. That's a hard skill for us. Totally get it. But look at one of the foundational skills. If I don't have the vocabulary and the background knowledge, then this gets really tricky. So being able to play into that as well. So that's instruction and intervention. So pausing there, we've looked at standards. We've thought about how to assess those standards at the different levels of cognitive complexity. And now we're into the I of sales about instruction and intervention. So let me give you a time here I'm going to pause. You can take to chat. You have 2 questions here that maybe you want to consider in either personal reflection or go to chat and share your thoughts about one or both of these questions. That's good. That's good, Pamela. Yes, thank you. I know the trick sometimes comes even in, do we have evidence base or do we have research base? And do people know the distinction of the two? Many people can claim research base, but not be able to claim so much on evidence. Yes, agree, Sophia. Yeah. And so there's a lot here to think about in terms of when we think the instruction in rent. And this isn't about we got to do all of these things. So sales meant to be just as a system, a way for us to think about. So we might just do some practice that's why with one standard, but not jumping in to try to do all this stuff at one time. It would become overwhelming at best. Uh, but maybe it is just starting from the beginning part. So the L in sales is all about leadership. And when we think about leadership here from Bass's work, I mean, this show's from 1990, but this book is several inches thick. And Bass's work, I mean, I like to take things back to some of the initial, work. So some of the pioneering research, some of the what we might know at certain times. But if you think of this, and then I posed a couple of questions here about leadership. So you can take a moment here and start to think about when you read this, what does it mean? Is there a word or words that stand out to you? How does this relate to your context? So thinking about leadership, go ahead, take to chat again here and share any kind of thoughts. Yes, Pamela, great. Mm-hmm. Thanks, Dawn. Structuring and restructuring. Ooh, you're back to our root word practice there of structuring and restructuring interaction. Yeah, yep, how our acts affect other people. Yeah, a lot of things that can be pulled out of this. And so thinking about this in terms of the aspect of that, we need more than just one person. It can't just be a principal or a coach, like multiple people who can really help to lead some of the efforts. And so when we dive into this, it's like I would not be doing all the work with standards. I would not be doing all the work with assessment. I would not be doing all the work construction and intervention. I have to figure out ways to build this knowledge base with others so that the work can continue on and be sustained. So the two things that I mentioned up front earlier in terms of instructional leadership of how in our work, if we see ourselves in a leadership role, which all coaches are, specialists are, principals, the hope is that we would see ourselves in roles of instructional leaders. That means how do we model our own learning and expectations? How do we do that? The second, how do we create the conditions for this kind of work? So I can't just tell you um, to implement something with fidelity if we haven't had, I mean, time, a spanning time of really being able to see demonstrations and to study and to practice. Uh, People might look at this in terms of thinking, oh, I'm totally on the leadership side. Yet when you read on the right-hand side, you might in your mind be thinking, well, that's what you think you are, all things leadership. Really, if you were to ask people, they would say you're many things management. So it's not about what we want other people to think. It's not what we believe we do. It's what are we doing? And we need that from other people to really get this thing, to really get an understanding of where do you fall here? Yeah, there's some managerial stuff to do, yet the instructional leadership is where the empirical evidence is. And Kraft and colleagues as well from their meta-analyses of coaching is that where we have the most effect is on helping people improve instruction. So that requires a whole lot of leadership in terms of our work. And so when we think then through this is that, oh, we would have to have some kind of a framework, some kind of a map. We think about improving schools, and this will lead us into the sustainability of, yeah, we need that strong leadership, but we need to know what are we trying to do? Where are we trying to go? And how are we going to move to that place? Are we using evidence-based materials, meaning they've likely gone through randomized control trial? We have effectiveness of that. The Institute of Education Sciences have had many different documents posted that provide a lot of that. Thinking about our different resources, and then this last part of a prototype. You know, hey, if we went back to that vocabulary piece and thought about routines, do we have any kind of prototype that people would follow um, as we want to have consistency or continuity? When we get to thinking about through leadership, including yourself as coaching, when we think of this within systemic change and we think about school improvement, really thinking as well about different individuals, like how do you really get people interested? They want to be part of the change. They have to have some ownership, but how do we get people ready for the change? How do we test things out in an initial implementation? So that might be we went back to sales and we had some number of people who wanted to take this dive into standards, assessment, instruction. Hey, we might have a handful of people who are eager and open and all in, and they become our initial implementers. We get to test things out, but we're also building the knowledge base and capacity for these champions to then help us move into this institutionalization, which is how do we continue to scaffold the work? How do we continue to move what we want our system to be doing? How do we keep scaling up? Change takes a long time, so it's going to take more people. And then how do we continue to improve what it is we're doing? If you think of 50 plus years of research, when people say we're doing the science of reading, uh, I don't know how you do 50 years plus or more of the research. You might have some knowledge about it, of the science of reading, but that likely takes a whole lot of time and study. And then sustainability. That is the final S. Sustainability is on page 180 and 181. And really, sustainability comes back to some of the work that Jan and Carolyn did in 2005 in the Reading Coach. And it's thinking about this here quote. I'll ask you to go to chat one more time here. And even within this, something that stands out to you, something that you might say, we need to work on, or we're already doing this, or we could always get better, or maybe you just pull out a key word or phrase. So take to chat kind of your open thoughts of this statement here about sustainability. Yeah, Nora, firm pledge. Yeah. And several of you can do this better collectively together. If there's no ceiling to learning. We don't plateau here. We've done it all. How do we always keep learning and learning and learning? Sustainability also shares some of this with the leadership of how we test things out. But it's also in this work by Lee in 2017 as starting out small, testing things out, really getting our champions to help build that knowledge base with others. Reluctant and resistant teachers might take some time to bring around, but they might get there. We have to keep on trying. And so as we think about continue to not throw things out, but how do we make things more streamlined, consistent? How do we make things to where we always are making it better or working smarter? As Vivian Robinson, as a New Zealand researcher, would 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 tell us here, really is about going narrow and deep. Narrow and deep in terms of our learning. Can't do it all at once. It's also here in terms of, let me do one more thing about sustainability, and that is with Lee's work of Lee talking about how sustainability, we should be thinking about this from day one of starting something new. And so if you're bringing on a new program, a new assessment, you want to try a new routine, strategy, think about that from the first day. How are we going to keep this moving forward, knowing we will still improve it? but we don't want to throw it out. That's where people get frustrated and tired of constant change. We never can get comfortable with something. So if I were in your roles, whether I'm an individual teacher, I'm a coach, I'm a principal, district, professional development specialist, whatever, there might be a number of things here that I could consider. And that is one, really understanding where people are with standards. And what do people really know? No assumptions, no generalizing, but what do we really know? And how do you find that out? Because I could ask anyone their knowledge or how do you feel about standards? Yeah, I'm good. Uh, Anything you need help with standard? No, I'm pretty good there. Well, yeah, evidence here and knowledge. What about the assessments or test blueprints? Yeah, someone had mentioned before about examples. So maybe things to think about here. Uh, when we think of instruction and intervention, maybe a next step is to really think about the organization, the school ecology. If we're working on something like vocabulary, is there evidence that this is really something we're working on? Or there's really not much evidence here that's something we could work on? Are there champions who can help, where you can build capacity and work together so that you have many people who are trying to move something forward and not just one or two people who are really trying to do it all? And then this last thing of maybe really thinking about the plan for sustaining things. What really are the plans? And if people just say, I don't know, we'll see based on test scores, well, we know it's going to take some time. But we also know people aren't going to get comfortable and understand how to implement something quickly. That all takes time. So with our series here of being able to kind of take through of where we started, just that initial knowledge base of student-focused coaching to uh, getting into the work, thinking about sustainability, and this time of some about how we shared the leadership and using something like sales, thinking about our own work as instructional leaders, how we can use a model or portions and parts of a model to help move a system forward. Nobody can have all the answers. Vivian Robinson is another one who I mentioned just a bit ago, but another person who in one of her more recent books said, if you can't articulate your advice, don't give it. And that really sticks with me because I think, oh, people are often filled with do this, try this, do this, yet they can't articulate. It's this buzzword. It's this new thing. And so I think that that's a really powerful piece of if you can't articulate your advice, don't give it. Really important. I do want to leave you with, as you have had my contact information, but if there are questions about things within the webinar here, or webinars, you can send those through Jessica, Becky, whomever. I'm happy for questions to come. I'll respond and include them on responses, but by all means, happy to support. So with that, I'll turn it back to Jessica.
Well, thank you, Daryl, and thank you so much for guiding us through this entire 4-part series. We've learned so much and can't believe that it's over. But we don't have time for questions, as you all know, but we really appreciate you spending all this time with us. A reminder to the audience that all these webinars have been recorded, and you can find them at the link in the chat and on the LCR Set website, as well as Glean Education website. And before we go, we do have a survey link that we put in the chat. Please fill that out so that we get some information on how this whole series was for you. And Dr. Michel, thank you so much for your time on behalf of Glean Education, the Sacramento County Office of Education, and the LCR Set Grant Initiative. Thank you to our wonderful attendees. We look forward to seeing you next year when we host another 4-part series with another expert in the coaching field. So stay tuned for more information soon. Thank you all.